In the last lecture, I reviewed the ascent of Napoleon III's empire and his plans for redeveloping Paris. But do not think that the Second Empire was the only architectural aesthetic and fashion in the Paris of Napoleon III. For as I have tried to show, he was a very clever politician, and often let conflicting styles in painting, as well as architecture, coexist if for no other reason than to quiet some of his political critics. And of course, as was the case in Britain at this time, the competing design ideology was the Gothic Revival. Gothic is typically stated to have been started by Abbé Suger with Saint-Denis in Paris in 1144, and therefore can be viewed as a truly indigenous French style of architecture. But we saw that the French had eventually returned to the classical architecture of the Italian Renaissance or Roman Revival, as being more appropriate for the aristocracy, although they tended to avoid the exuberance of the Italian Baroque. This pro-classical taste was shared by the leaders of the French Revolution, who viewed Gothic cathedrals as symbols of the ancient regime's first estate, the clergy. In pre-revolutionary France, there were three estates: those who pray, the clergy; those who fight, the nobility; and those who work, the peasants. Therefore, Gothic was rejected by the Revolution as being symbolic of the ancient regime, while the classical continued as the favored style, this time as it represented the ideals of the Roman Republic. Therefore, in the early days of the Revolution, the new republic, similar to Henry VIII's dissolution of the abbeys in 1538, when he proclaimed the independence of the English Church from Rome, the new French government confiscated much of the property of the French church to pay for its expenses. Notre Dame was vandalized. The statues in the King's Gallery on the west front were removed and beheaded because it was thought they were actually statues of saints. These were uncovered in 1977 in a dig near the cathedral and are now on exhibit in Paris's Cluny Museum. The cathedral's 13th century crossing spire, or flèche, was also removed to decrease its silhouette on the city's horizon. The building was rededicated first to the cult of reason, and then as a temple of the Supreme Being. The statues of the Virgin Mary on its many altars were replaced by statues of the Goddess of Liberty. Yes, statues of liberty. Notre Dame was eventually used as a warehouse for food, while proposals were made for its demolition. But the greatest architectural crime was the almost complete demolition of the abbey at Cluny, the largest church in France and the largest church in Europe, second only to the new St. Peter's in overall size. In 1793, the abbey's extensive library, as well as its records for the past 8 centuries, were wantonly burned, an irreplaceable loss to humanity. As most churches were during the Revolution, it was vandalized and then eventually sold to 2 men who systematically demolished the building and sold its parts to build other buildings, the surviving pieces of which are now in Paris's Architectural Museum. So with the declaration of the Republic following the Revolution, the Catholic Church in France was effectively dissolved, with the new government confiscating its land, reputed to have been 10% of the country, to pay for the new government's debts. One of the more drastic de-Christianization efforts was the adoption of the 10-day week, which over time made it almost impossible for Christians to determine when the Sunday day of worship occurred. Nonetheless, the Republic didn't need churches anymore, so they could be demolished if they were Gothic, or if they were done in a classical fashion, they could be made into museums, as we saw what was done with Saint Geneviève. So while the English had divorced themselves from the Roman Catholic Church with Henry VIII's decree of 1538, the English had still remained faithful Christian believers, in contrast to the atheistic Republic. And therefore, while the English had abandoned the country's abbeys, they did not destroy their Gothic churches. With the fall of the Republic, Napoleon I had reinstituted the Catholic Church as a political sop to the French Catholics, but still promulgated the classical vocabulary of the Roman Empire to symbolize his reign. But with the fall of Napoleon in 1815, the monarchy and the church had been reinstituted by the Allied powers, reversing the power structure and inviting revenge between Christians and atheists, as memories of the Republic's atrocities against French Christians were still raw. So the Gothic Revival in France actually lagged behind that in Britain by some 80 years, if we use Strawberry Hill as the start of the British Gothic Revival. The movement in France got its start following the final defeat of Napoleon. Almost immediately, Christian scholars began to inventory the state of the country's churches. In the mid-1820s, the writer Victor Hugo had picked up the standard to preserve France's Gothic heritage, with a series of papers on the importance of the country's architecture. The piece de resistance being his 1831 publication of his novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the main character of which was not Quasimodo or Esmeralda, but the building itself. In his novel, Hugo shone a light on the terrible condition of the country's cultural heritage and asked, "What are we doing? We have these magnificent buildings that we're just letting decay." This was the intent for publishing The Hunchback of Notre Dame, to bring the dilapidated condition of these Gothic buildings to the attention of the French public, with the hope that someone would be interested in restoring them, which of course was done by none other than King Louis-Philippe, who, as one of his first decrees upon ascending the throne, established the position of Inspector of Historical Monuments with the task of restoring the country's medieval architectural monuments. The position was soon filled by Prosper Mérimée, another novelist best known for his short novel, Carmen, that would be the basis for Bizet's opera of the same name. Mérimée was also an archaeologist and amateur architect. Very few historians ever mention the critical role played by Mérimée in France's restoration of its architectural heritage, as well as his patronage of who would become France's leading architectural theorist of the late 19th century. Mérimée held this position from 1833 to 1860, a 27-year period in which he was in charge of the restoration of many of France's most important buildings. For this task, he hired the nephew of a close friend, a young architect named Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who was anti-establishment from the get-go. At the age of 16, he had helped build barricades in Paris during the 1830 revolt. 2 years later, he had refused to go to the Académie des Beaux-Arts to learn architecture, for he wanted a practical education, so he worked his way up through the professional ladder rather than going to school. Mérimée employed Viollet in restoring what reads as a lecture in the history of French medieval architecture, because Viollet will restore La Madeleine at Vézelay in 1839, Sainte-Chapelle in 1840, Notre Dame in 1844, Carcassonne, the medieval walled city, in 1852, and then the great Romanesque Cathedral Saint-Sernin in Toulouse in 1862. Viollet-le-Duc will become the leading French architectural restorer of Gothic buildings. Now, when I say restoration, similar to what we saw happening in Britain during this same time, it's not what we think of restoration as today, which is keeping to the authentic and trying to keep or, quote, restore, unquote, everything like it was. Viollet's restoration was really a kind of updating or unifying the building. We've seen these Gothic buildings take forever to complete, and we also saw that when they started the next section, they had the predilection of wanting it to be in the new style that was then in fashion, as opposed to continuing to build the structure in its original style. So these buildings often have segments that were from different styles, and one of the things that Viollet tried to do was to give more coherency to the overall aesthetic and look of these buildings by tearing some of the original pieces down and remaking it in a way that pulled it together as a design such that Viollet thought it should have been erected in the first place. Of course, this isn't authentic, so you have to be careful a little bit about looking at these buildings, because we never know how much of it is authentic and how much of it is 19th century Viollet-le-Duc. For instance, this is one of the gargoyles Notre Dame is famous for, yet Viollet added it during his restoration. In other words, it's not an original sculpture. I wanted to show you that we all have egos, and even Viollet-le-Duc had. He put his face on the head of one of the sculptures of the 12 apostles that he added to the base of the new spire, or flèche, that he erected on Notre Dame. As I have often pointed out, One cannot understand architectural history by only studying architects, because many times it was the influence of those who were not architects but patrons who had a direct impact on the realization of a building or a career. Even the role of fate or serendipity often plays a role, and in my experience, this is the case more times than not. Such was the history of Prosper Mérimée and his youthful charge, Viollet-le-Duc. Remember that Mérimée had been named by King Louis-Philippe to the position of Inspector of Historic Monuments in 1833. Things were going very well for Mérimée and Viollet as Viollet began the restoration of Notre Dame. And then 1848, the year of political upheaval hit. That was followed by Louis Napoleon's rise to power, and yet somehow Mérimée continued in his important court position during this political upheaval. In fact, he remained in it until 1860. The reason for Mérimée continuation in his position, as well as the continued professional rise of Viollet-le-Duc in French architectural circles, was due to serendipity. Prior to Louis-Philippe's taking the throne in 1830 and his appointment of Mérimée to his position, Mérimée had taken a long trip to Spain to study its art and architecture. Rather than immediately returning to Paris following the overthrow of Charles X, which resulted in Louis-Philippe's rise to power, Mérimée decided to lay low and enjoy the sights in Spain while events in Paris sorted themselves out. Because of this decision, he had met a Spanish aristocrat who was a kindred spirit. This man, the Count of Monteo, had a young daughter for whom Mérimée was engaged as a French tutor. Some 23 years later, she would marry Napoleon III and become the Empress Eugénie. Because of Mérimée's decision to avoid Paris at a time of popular revolt, his future, as well as that of Viollet-le-Duc's, was assured. Within 2 months of having declared himself emperor in 1852, Napoleon III married Eugénie in a half-restored Notre Dame that Mérimée had commissioned Viollet-le-Duc to personally decorate for the occasion. While Mérimée became a regular member of the imperial court, having the empress's ear whenever he needed it, which allowed him to expand his preservation efforts under the patronage of the empress, Viollet-le-Duc also became a welcomed courtesan of Eugénie's. While Viollet was conducting his restorations prior to the wedding of Napoleon and Eugénie, he had been making notes on the practical knowledge of construction he was gaining with the intention of eventually publishing these. Following the wedding, Viollet published the first of what would eventually total 10 volumes in 1854 of his History of French Architecture, his Analytical Dictionary of French Architecture, from the 11th to the 16th century. This was followed by his Analytical Dictionary of French Furnishings in 1858, both of which had thrust him into the limelight of Paris's architectural circles by articulating a theory of architecture based upon the inherent relationship between a building's structural system and its form that was a direct or honest result of what the structure, and only the structure, required. What soon would be labeled structural rationalism. He posited French Gothic as the best example of this architectonic approach, claiming that every piece in a Gothic cathedral was designed to perform a specific structural or constructional function, similar to what Pugin had argued, quote, nothing could be removed, unquote. The battle of the ancients versus the moderns that we saw emerge during the reign of Louis XIV had continued over the past 175 years, albeit with an ebb and flow that depended upon the point of view and abilities of those who chose to partake in it. Seemed to have finally come to a head during the Second Empire in 1863. I mentioned at the start of this lecture that Napoleon III was a shrewd politician who was very sensitive to the pulse of his subjects. While Viollet continued to restore Gothic buildings, aided undoubtedly by the patronage of the Empress, Napoleon III had continued to erect Second Empire buildings, such as the Palais d'Industrie for the 1855 World's Fair and the Opera House. This both-and attitude of the emperor extended to French painting as well. Paris had been the scene of a biennial salon, a showing of fine art paintings since 1748. While originally sponsored by Courbet's Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture that had been founded in 1648, following the Revolution, the Republican government had closed all of the Royal Academies, while it opened up the salons to the public. Following the defeat of Napoleon I and the restoration of Louis XVIII, the Académie des Beaux-Arts was formed in 1816 by the merger of three of Louis XIV's former academies, the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, the Academy of Music that had been founded in 1668, and the Royal Academy of Architecture, founded in 1671. It was the Fine Arts Division of the Académie des Beaux-Arts that had reinstituted the biennial salons. At the 1855 World's Exhibition, we have seen that the French had mounted the first international art exhibit, which had rejected a number of paintings submitted by the avant-garde painter Gustave Courbet. Courbet decided to defy convention and had mounted his own show in his own Pavilion of Realism, a structure he had erected next to the Pavilion des Beaux-Arts, in which the center of interest was his painting, The Artist's Studio. Courbet's independent stance had inspired the upcoming generation of French painters led by Edouard Manet. Manet's latest painting, The Luncheon on the Grass, that many art historians credit as being the harbinger of a new innovative movement in painting, Impressionism, had been rejected for the 1863 Paris Salon by the Academy, whose academic painters, such as Alexander Cabanel, whose The Birth of Venus was shown at the 1863 Salon and immediately purchased by the emperor. However, the emperor, ever conscious of public opinion, stepped into the fray over the rejection of Manet's painting and demanded that a separate exhibition, the Salon des Refusés, be held to quell the public rumors that were the result of over 4,000 paintings being rejected that year by the Academy. The emperor said that the public should be allowed to judge the merits of the refused paintings for themselves. To have a better understanding of the context within which modern art, including architecture, evolved in the face of the battle of the ancients and moderns during the Second Empire, one can draw an analogy with Viollet-le-Duc's experience in 1863 with that of Edouard Manet's earlier in the same year. In November 1863, Napoleon attempted to liberalize the Académie des Beaux-Arts by divorcing it from the Académie de France, centered in Rome, by eliminating the Académie des Beaux-Arts' government financial support. This was reflected in changing the school's name to the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. The following month, the emperor had added insult to this injury by appointing Viollet-le-Duc, the advocate of a modern Gothic architecture, to the new Ecole, the bastion of classical architecture, as a professor of aesthetics on December 6, 1863. When Viollet-le-Duc took to the podium for the first time on January 29, 1864, however, a student protest squashed his inaugural address. He tried 6 more times to deliver a lecture in the hallowed halls that he had sworn never to attend as a student, but each effort was greeted with the same catcalls and hail of eggs and vegetables. So in painting, as in architecture, music, literature, and elsewhere, we find the sides being drawn between tradition and innovation, or what the French had already named the avant-garde. The analogy to Edouard Manet's experience is complete with the parallel formation of a new school dedicated to avant-garde architecture in 1865. Spurned by the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, Viollet-le-Duc had used his connections within the imperial court to obtain permission to form an alternative private architectural school in Paris, the Ecole Centrale d'Architecture. Prior to being named to the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, Viollet-le-Duc had taken up the pen once again to give voice to his theories. In fact, they probably were to be used as his notes for his upcoming lectures that never took place, and by the end of 1863 had completed the first volume of his Discourses on Architecture. A follow-up second volume was released in 1872. Following in the footsteps of Puget and Ruskin, Viollet-le-Duc also advocated for a return to Gothic architecture, but the three were not arguing the same theory nor even advocating for the same type of Gothic architecture. Whereas Puget had championed the English Gothic architecture of the 1200s for its perceived spiritual advantages, Christianity versus Roman paganism, as well as he argued that the people who produced the original Gothic buildings were spiritually purer than people were in his day, he viewed the architecture of the 13th century as being the best example of the art of architecture and was arguing for social reforms to return society back to the good old days of 1300 so we could once again produce authentic Gothic buildings. He wanted to change society to get better architecture. Pugin had espoused an architectonic, that is, an architecture as structure and construction, approach to Gothic architecture and favored a vertically accented style. Ruskin, however, had focused on the Gothic architecture of 14th century Venice for its moral high ground, in both its honest use of materials and colors, as well as a shared design responsibility between all those who constructed the building. We saw Ruskin arguing for social improvement, that is, arguing to change architecture to get a better society. He saw the Doge's palace as the high point in architecture. Ruskin talked about architecture in a representational sense, that is, he focused on the role of ornament in architecture, preferably polychromatic ornament, and championed a horizontal version of Venetian Gothic. Viollet-le-Duc had no interest in architecture as it pertained to spiritual or moral value. He looked at architecture as the art of construction, as one would do within the French rationalist tradition, and what he saw in Gothic construction was the expression of a rational structure using contemporary material with contemporary techniques. Viollet-le-Duc is going to take Soufflot's and Labrust's commitment to expressing the rationality of Gothic structure in their interiors of French buildings as the next logical step. That is, he is going to argue against using classical details to hide a Gothic structure, but to fully embrace Gothic architecture because it is honest and rational. Viollet is going to look at Gothic construction as the zenith of rationalism. In other words, the vaulting system that we know that Gothic architecture employed was the perfect, rationally derived structural system for the material and the technology they had at the time, which was, of course, handcrafted stone construction. In other words, Viollet-le-Duc is beginning to develop his theory that architecture should be a building of the time that builds it. Therefore, it should reflect not only the inherent characteristics of the material used, but also the technology of the time, what the Germans will eventually term Zeitgeist. He echoed Owen Jones's argument not to copy the Gothic buildings from the past, but to use the primary architectonic principles of Gothic architecture that he had deduced from his early Reconstruction experience, structural rationalism that is, to evolve a new 19th century version of Gothic, one that employed all of the materials available to a contemporary architect, meaning stone and iron. Quote, "Let us be well persuaded, once again, that architecture can take on new forms only if it seeks them by means of a rigorous application of a new structure," unquote. Like Jones, he really is interested in the past only as far as it could inform the present on how to do a contemporary architecture correctly. That is, how does one generate a 19th century building, not a 13th or 14th or 15th century building, as a creative artist, not a mere copyist of the past. He is going to argue for a 19th century architecture that is rational, that is based on a coherent system of construction and the composition influenced by, but not imitative of, Gothic. That is, quote, "Architecture should be a direct expression of current material technology and functional needs," unquote. We are going to see Viollet's writings to be more influential on the next generation than his contemporaries. In these two volumes of discourses, Viollet begins to explore where an architect could take 19th century architecture using the new materials and new technologies to develop a modern architecture based on structural rationalism and material honesty. In other words, you should be able to develop an architecture where you utilize and express each material's inherent characteristics. We've seen that the French have been using iron to reinforce masonry construction now for over 50 years, and that Labrouste in the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève had taken it out of its masonry corset for all to see in the interior. Viollet is going to be the first French architect to propose using exposed iron on a building's exterior, as well as to actually make an architectural aesthetic out of the play of lithic stone and tensile iron. And so what we will see Viollet proposing, albeit it is still clothed in Gothic details. Remember, change is a two-step process. is an architecture that celebrates the complementary relationship of stone in compression and iron in tension. You can recognize Viollet's drawings from this period by his use of one of three details. First is what is known as a dwarf column. Stone in compression wants to be as short as possible so it doesn't buckle. These will typically be supported on corbel supports. Second, he will ornament his columns with collars at their mid-height. You could ask where is the logic in this, and my only answer is that it increases the diameter in a column exactly where it first tends to buckle. And third, he will employ sloped columns. Why? A typical Gothic buttress, not the flyer, resists the thrust of the vault with sheer weight that resolves the bending in the buttress because it's a vertical element that does not have a horizontal component. But as soon as I slope the column, it has a horizontal component which rationally resolves the thrust into pure compression rather than bending, which is much more efficient and so reduces the required section of the buttress. In the first, the 1863 volume of Discourses, Viollet included this illustration at the last moment without any accompanying text. In the second edition of 1872, he stated that it shows an iron frame that supports a non-load-bearing glazed terracotta exterior. By 1872, this type of construction was already being used by French builders. And so we see the parallel evolution of this construction technique. First in the United States with Bogardus's work with the McCulloch Shot Tower of 1855, which was the first example of a brick non-load-bearing curtain wall on an iron frame. And we see that the French were not that far behind in developing the independent iron-framed building, what will eventually be called skyscraper construction. In fact, in 1865, less than 2 years after Viollet had first published the iron and curtain wall illustration, engineer and social philosopher Henri-Jules Bourrier published his Aerodomes, an essay on a new form of dwelling, in which was contained the first design of a skyscraper that I have found. As Second Empire Paris was a model for the city of the future, it should come as no surprise that the first documented proposal to build tall, urban buildings, that is skyscrapers, was a product of Second Empire Paris, and not the United States that was still in the throes of the Civil War. By 1865, the population of Paris was exploding. The city's population had nearly doubled during the Second Empire, as people flooded into the city from the rural countryside in search of work, made all the easier by Napoleon's growing network of railroads that converged on Paris. If one assumed that the Second Empire would simply continue on its path of social order and prosperity into the 20th century, the ballooning population of Paris would eventually have to be housed vertically, that the autocratic regime of the Second Empire could have easily decreed and financed. Remarkably, Bourrier had proposed not just an individual tower, but had designed an entire utopian urban complex, similar in scale and functional organization to what the emperor had only just completed with Le Hall, one that comprised of not one or two, but 25 11-story towers and two 11-story, 4-block-long courtyard monster megablocks that were linked with sky bridges, all of which he referred to as aerodomes, that is, dwellings in the air. Marrying the new technology of the passenger elevator to the by then well-understood iron skeletal frame, Bourrier had designed the first skyscraper, not as a multi-storied office building, as will be the case in the United States, but as a multi-storied apartment building for Paris. Bourrier's towers respected the city's 20-meter height limit by carrying up the first 5 floors to the cornice limit and then placing a shallower 6-story residential tower on top of the lower tower, thereby creating a step back at the city's constant cornice height. This not only would reduce the size of the building's shadows, but also created a pleasant promenade around the tower's setbacks that provided great views to the city below and were linked to adjacent towers with glass-covered sky bridges. Ease of passage and large amounts of daylight were two of his primary concerns. The towers were supported by iron skeletal frames that were stiffened against wind loads with portal bracing, a system of very stiff or rigid connections between the beams and the columns that imparted a rigidity to the structure that enabled it to resist wind loads, similar to how diagonal bracing works without the physical obstruction of the diagonal lines crossing at head height. This would have been completely unnecessary if the building had been constructed with traditional masonry bearing walls. Could these buildings have been built in 1865 Paris? To the right is the exact same portal bracing Bordier had detailed that was used in the Meunier chocolate factory of 1867. The same year that Bordier published a second, more detailed design. Bordier's utopian ideas were picked up and further refined 2 years later by Jules-Antoine Moulin, a physician specializing in respiratory ailments that were the result of the urban pollution of Second Empire Paris, who also proposed a utopian city incorporating 10-story towers in his 1869 book, Paris in the Year 2000. Quote, "The first floor is occupied by gallery streets of unequal dimensions. On the upper floors, the model houses are divided into a multitude of rooms of various sizes, all illuminated, some overlooking the street and others the courtyard. A mechanical elevator, which goes all the way down to the cellars, permits furniture, fuel, and packages to be lifted to any floor for the benefits of people who live on the higher levels and do not like to tire themselves out. Model houses thus rise up to a height of 10 stories. The architects proposed to take that number to 15 or even 18 in order to obtain greater economies in the cost of construction, but the government did not adopt those proposals, which would have caused the citizens to live at too great a height and obliged them to make overly difficult ascents. Finally, let us not forget to mention that all the model dwellings are linked together and to the old houses by large covered bridges and numerous footbridges, which permit circulation in all directions and at the height of every floor. We need to review what advances the French have made with iron framing since we left off with the 1855 World's Fair. But before we do, some people still need to be convinced that France was, indeed, ahead of the United States in more areas in 1865 than just iron framing. One such category was space travel. In 1865, Jules Verne published his sci-fi thriller From the Earth to the Moon, in which a rocket capsule carrying 3 astronauts is launched from a pad in, of all places, using what little calculations were known at this time for the best chance of success, Tampa, Florida. Although on the Gulf Coast, it's only 50 miles due south of Cape Canaveral on the Atlantic. The first significant use of iron after the 1855 fair is by Henri Labrousse, the designer of the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève. Although he designed the Bibliothèque Nationale in 1854, its construction didn't begin until 1859. For its reading room, he created a glorious space by placing 9 iron domes over a 9-square grid set on 16 slender cast iron columns. But what we're really interested in from Viollet's ideas are the book stacks that are located in back of the charge desk. Because they are 4-story, all iron frame construction set within the building's masonry exterior walls. In contrast to Labrousse's contemporary, the builder Bogart's exposed, traditionally ornamented iron members in his cast iron fronts, Labrousse's architectural sensibility allowed him to experiment with an innovative aesthetic by detailing no ornament of any kind on this exposed iron structure, giving it an appearance that still looks remarkably modern. There are 2 reasons for the use of iron. Number 1 is that the stacks are to be fireproof. This is the National Library, and very rare books are stored here. Number 2 is we want to minimize the use of gas lighting. This still involves the use of open flames. So even the floors are made out of an iron grillwork to allow as much daylight to filter down to the lower floors as possible. When you actually look at the detailing, It looks like it could have been designed today from the standpoint of the straightforward wrought and cast iron structure. It's thought that Labrouste was influenced by the first construction of iron ships that was happening at this time. In other words, we are beginning to use iron rather than wood to construct ships because it is stronger than wood. And so I think you can easily see these stacks as a type of ship construction in which we go down into the hull. This is not going to be the only time we will see naval architecture impact building architecture over the next century. There was also a French parallel to Bogardus's precedent of supporting a masonry curtain wall on an iron frame, first tentatively done in 1855 in the McCulloch Shot Tower, and then carried into a multi-story building application in the 1858 Santa Catalina warehouse. Outside of Paris, in the suburb of Saint-Ouen, a six-story warehouse for the Saint-Ouen Railway and Dock Company was constructed in 1864, only 6 years after Bogardus's Cuban warehouse was erected. The French building had 3 of its 4 exterior walls comprised of an exposed cast iron frame that supported a masonry enclosure on each level. Designed by engineer Hippolyte Fontaine, the exterior frame consisted of cast iron columns and arched cast iron beams that bore a remarkable resemblance to the exterior of Bogardus's Havana warehouse. The interior was completely framed in iron, with cast iron columns supporting built-up wrought iron girders. The girders supported cast iron beams from which spanned flat arches made from hollow bricks. But the building that best proves that Borier's aerodomes could have been built in 1865 was the Minier chocolate factory in Noiselle, an eastern suburb of Paris. It was designed in 1869 by architect Jules Saulnier and fabricated by engineer contract Armand Moisin. The factory building consists of an independent 3-story trussed wrought iron structure that sits on the surviving piers in a riverbed from a demolished building. Moissan's iron structure was laterally braced in the interior with portal braces, the exact technique that Bordier had drawn 4 years earlier in his aerodomes, and in the exterior with exposed iron diagonal bracing running in the plane of the exterior. The exterior skin of the building consists of glazed hollow tiles that contain alternating rondos with the initial M or abstracted cacao flowers that are set within the bracing. It bears a remarkable resemblance to the rendering of such a system published in Viollet-le-Duc's 1863 edition of his Discourses. This brings us to what many consider to have been the apogee of the Second Empire, the 1867 World's Exhibition, planned by Napoleon III to not only show off his recent construction projects throughout Paris, that had simply made the city the envy of the civilized world, but also to seemingly prove that he had kept the promise of the 1855 fair and his regime, that is, to achieve, quote, the greatest good for the greatest number, unquote. The Grand Louvre had finally been completed. The Tuileries Palace was now linked to the Louvre by the newly completed North Gallery that formed a new enclosed courtyard, the Cour Napoléon, in which was contained the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel. The scaffolding around Garnier's new opera house was dismantled in order to show off its completed exterior. Haussmann's new boulevards were lined with newly constructed, fireproof apartment buildings that were serviced by new water mains, sewers, sidewalks, and gas streetlights. The technology of the 19th century was being employed to create an urban paradise, and the emperor was showing the rest of the world what the future could look like. The British had attempted a repeat of their successful 1851 fair in 1862, but had been overshadowed by the premature death of Prince Albert and the beginning of the Queen's subsequent period of mourning. In order to avoid a repeat of the embarrassment of the unfinished 1855 Palais d'Industrie, Napoleon decreed in 1864 that the fair should take place in 1867. Seemingly allowing for plenty of time to erect the necessary facilities. As the 1855 exhibition was still standing, the Champ de Mars, across from the Ecole Militaire, along the south bank of the river where the Eiffel Tower now stands was chosen. Frederick Dublet, an engineer and sociologist who was greatly valued by Napoleon, once again was put in overall charge of the fair, as he had been with the 1855 fair. But this time he also took on the design of the exposition building. Architect Leopold Hardy gave the rational plan a form, and it was constructed by engineer Jean-Baptiste Krantz, who was assisted by the young Gustave Eiffel. Manifesting the French penchant for the classification of everything in an encyclopedic fashion, Dublet set out to design a building that allowed visitors to easily compare products from the various countries, as well as to study one country's exhibit in totality. What resulted was neither a large greenhouse, like the 1851 Crystal Palace, nor a train station, like the 1855 Paris Palais d'Industrie, but an efficient, all-iron building with little architectural pretense that contained more than twice the gallery area of the British Crystal Palace erected only 16 years earlier. It was at 1,600 feet, however, not quite as long as the Crystal Palace's 1,850 feet, but it was much wider at 1,240 feet. It was arranged in a plan of 8 concentric rings, each dedicated to a topic, and radial spokes that housed the exhibits of one nation. Therefore, a visitor could choose to explore either a topic or a country. In many ways, it could be considered to have been Paris's first true department store. The topics of each ring, as one worked from the exterior to the inner court, were as follows. First, a perimeter comprised of a promenade of restaurants and cafes of the world that was open until 11 p.m., even though the exhibits inside closed at 6. These comprised 7 galleries or rings: machines, raw materials, clothing, furniture, liberal arts, fine arts, and the history of work. Before we look at the main exhibition building, the grounds contain some 100 outbuildings, which established a trend to have a carnival atmosphere surrounding the official fair building. In this slide, you can see that the French were not going to be shown up by Great Britain in having the tallest tower. The French built a lighthouse on the left that was taller than the British Iron Tower on the right. Walking up to the main exhibition hall, you see how cafes surrounded the perimeter. Note the iron exterior of the hall, as well as the weak attempt to create an entrance by changing the 3-arch arcade in each bay to a single arch. Here are the Austrian and Swiss restaurants. One entered into the gallery of machines with a grand stairway to a second-level viewing platform. Note the large clear-story windows on each side of the radial hall. Eventually one arrived at a completely enclosed courtyard, decorated with pleasant gardens and fountains. A place of pause after a hectic, almost mind-numbing couple of hours of what the future beheld. Nonetheless, the French still managed to work into this court small-scale exhibits on weights, measures, and money of the countries. From the standpoint of architectural history, the 1867 fair may best be remembered for the first exhibits of reinforced concrete construction, such as this all-concrete house by François Cogniet, as well as a number of fireproof flooring systems that employed hollow bricks of either plaster of Paris or terracotta, a technique that will slowly be adopted in the United States. The fair's most poignant exhibit was that of Prussia and the new steel guns that the armorer Krupp had just started to fabricate. Although it was stated that these were so large that they could only be used for coastal defenses, in less than 3 years their siblings would surround Paris, marking the end of the Second Empire and any dream of building a skyscraper in Paris. For there is no doubt in my mind that the French would have built the first skyscraper in the world, and we would probably be calling them aerodomes, except for the actions of one person, and that person is Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia. Remember, at the start of this lecture, I talked about two countries that were very much impacted by the 1847 revolutions. France was one, and the other one was Germany. Well, actually, I should have said Prussia, for there was no Germany yet. Not until Otto von Bismarck took over control of the Prussian government and set his sights on the unification of Germany. So how does Bismarck actually influence the history of architecture? Over the course of my lectures, I've shown you that there was no Germany as a single governmental entity at this time. In fact, at one point, there were over 300 political units that made up the territory we now call Germany, compared to the one governmental entity that had called itself France since 843. So the main power in Central Europe actually had been Austria at this time, and it wasn't until 1701 that Prussia began as an idea. But once that idea started, the objective of the Prussians was pretty straightforward, and that was to grow and eventually overcome the power of Austria in being the main power in Central Europe, and basically pull together the various little government entities in order to unify them as a country called Germany. 165 years later, the Prussians finally defeated the Austrians in 1866 and thereby became the 800-pound gorilla in the center of Europe. The only real roadblock to German unification was the proud independent kingdom of Bavaria. Bavaria had always been its own country and saw no reason to surrender its independence to the Prussians in a unified government, because obviously Prussia was much larger and much stronger than Bavaria at this time, and they knew that if they said yes to the Prussians, they would play second fiddle and eventually be absorbed by Prussia. Bavaria was staunchly as Catholic as Prussia was Lutheran, so the Bavarians had no interest whatsoever in a unified Germany. So Bismarck needed a ploy to force the Bavarians to voluntarily surrender their independence to a greater German union. Bismarck knew there was only one way that this would happen, and that was to involve the hated French who, led by Louis XIV, had first invaded Alsace and later Bavaria before burning these lands under a scorched earth policy. Then, a little more than 100 years later, Napoleon I had occupied all the German lands, including Prussia, in 1806, removing the Brandenburg Gate's cherished quadriga and taking it with him to Paris, as a reminder to who was now in charge, where it remained until he was defeated in 1815. So in other words, there were 9 years of occupation that the German people had to endure by the French, and there were Germans still alive in 1866 that remembered the French occupation. If Bismarck could only trick Napoleon III, he even had that feared name, Napoleon. If Bismarck could only trick Napoleon into attacking Prussia, Bavaria would have to come to the common defense of the fatherland, and that would be the end of the game. There was a deception using fake letters and newspaper reports by the Prussians that allowed Bismarck to shame Napoleon into declaring war on Prussia on July 19, 1870, which led to the Franco-Prussian War. In only just 6 weeks, Napoleon mobilized his troops, led them into a Prussian trap at Sedan, where not only was he captured, but also he had to surrender 104,000 French troops on September 2, 1870. This was the greatest military blunder by the French army up until World War II. Napoleon's political enemies back in Paris wasted no time in declaring the end of the Second Empire and began the formation of the Third Republic 2 days later on September 4th. So while the French in Paris were celebrating but fighting among themselves over who was now in charge, the Prussians just continued to march to Paris and had it surrounded 2 weeks later, and began what would become a 4.5-month-long siege. While Bismarck wanted to bombard Paris and get it over with, there were political reasons from both the Prussian king and also his generals who did not want to bombard Paris at this time, hoping to starve Paris to its knees without having to destroy it, with all of the negative international public relations such as a bombardment would cause. With victory seemingly in their hands, the confident Prussians used, of all places, Louis XIV's Hall of Mirrors at Versailles to declare the formation of the new country, Germany. Talk about revenge being a dish best served cold. Of all the places in the world to form Germany, in other words, to sign the proclamation on a piece of paper saying we are the new country, Germany, they did it in Louis XIV's reception hall, immediately on the other side of the wall outside of his bedroom. The Germans chose to do it in Paris, as memories go back a long way, right? Back to 1806 when, yeah, you took our quadriga, and now we're here, and it's payback time. So on January 18th, 1871, Germany was established as a country in France. They signed the paper there just to rub it in the French nose. So you may not realize that Germany is actually 100 years younger than America as a country. Meanwhile, Paris was still under siege. People are really growing hungry now because no food has been shipped in for over 3 months, so they're eating rats and sawdust. I've seen the menu from a restaurant during the siege, and it's disgusting, but that's the battle. The French are too proud to admit it that they have been beaten by the Germans. They still hope that the remaining French troops outside of Paris can break the siege. But the Germans, we can call them that now, are battling the French throughout the countryside, and they're slowly but surely mopping up the remaining French resistance. Eventually, the German Kaiser gets tired of this. We've accomplished our mission. We got Bavaria to surrender its independence. We are now a country. Let's end this now. He asks Bismarck. Bismarck looks at him like, I wanted to do that 4 months ago, and agrees. Let the bombardment begin. So those huge new Krupp cannon begin shelling Paris. Paris surrenders in 3 days, and then the Germans held a brief victory parade through Paris along the Champs-Élysées on February 17th. They then withdrew their forces, allowing food trains to go in as part of the deal for the armistice, breaking the siege of Paris and allowing food and fuel into Paris from England for the first time in over 4 months. The rich, the middle class, and the national government immediately got out of town. In other words, within a week, over 200,000 Parisians fled. They saw the terror of the guillotine coming once again, for this will be the 3rd time that Paris will be subjected to socialist revolt, and you would be a fool not to escape with your life while you could. They expect the city to flare up once again, and it comes to a head a month later on March 18th, when the conservative government, that was elected by the French in the countryside, tried to secretly get the country's cannons out from the armory in Paris. The gig is up for the socialists, for they understand what the government is trying to do, and again the barricades go up. They form what's known as the Paris Commune. You have the first actual communist government established in Europe in Paris on March 28, 1871. They adopt the red flag. They went back to the Republican calendar of 1789. In other words, they returned to the year 78 or something close to that, and they went back to the 12-month calendar of 3 10-day weeks. They set out to establish a communist society in Paris. Meanwhile, the French national government still had to fight the Germans until a final peace treaty was signed on May 10th. This allowed the government to finally refocus its troops on Paris, and by May 21st, Paris was once again surrounded, but now by its own troops. The national government, meanwhile, had decided to solve the Parisian political problem once and for all by the only means possible, to kill as many of the city's troublesome radicals as possible. Expiation will be complete. While the communards prepared for the final battle, they also prepared to set fire to the buildings that represented to them the institutions they most despised. The recently completed Tuileries Palace had been filled with barrels of gunpowder and detonated. The ensuing fire slowly engulfed the entire complex, making its way to the Louvre and its invaluable collections. By 11 a.m. the next morning, Wednesday, May 24th, the City Hall was torched, joining those buildings already burning that included the Royal Palace, the Prefecture of Police, the Palace of Justice, the Ministry of Finance, the Orsay Palace, the Department of State, and the Gare de Lyon. Entire sections of the city were ablaze, as a recent drought allowed the flames to quickly spread as they were whipped by the wind. Fortunately, a steady downpour the following day stopped the fire in the Louvre, but only after it had totally destroyed the Tuileries Palace and the library in the Louvre. But before it had reached the Louvre's priceless collections, preventing a major cultural holocaust. The Venus de Milo was spared only through blind luck. It had been hidden from the Prussians in the basement of the prefect of police that had been torched by the communards. As people were sifting through the building's ashes, it was discovered that a burst water pipe had saved the irreplaceable statue from certain destruction. A similar literary holocaust was only prevented by the advancing national troops who had simply moved through the city's streets faster than had the communards who were in charge of torching Le Brusque's Bibliothèque Nationale could complete their dastardly assignment. Even Notre Dame Cathedral was spared total destruction only at the last possible moment when the communards decided not to set it ablaze, even though it had been prepped by stacking all of its pews and chairs into a pyre, because they feared that the fire would spread to the Hôtel du Hospital across the street in which a multitude of wounded communards were housed. It took the troops 7 days to completely liquidate all resistance within the city, but finally on May 29th, the city was quiet. Le Figaro demanded justice. Never has such an opportunity presented itself for curing Paris of the moral gangrene that has been consuming it for the past 20 years. The Parisians must submit to the laws of war, however terrible they may be. Today, clemency equals lunacy, unquote. The final tally killed by both sides varies between 20,000 and 25,000 men, women, and children killed during this brief but ruthless civil war. The total killed by the Prussians in Paris during the 5-month siege was but 6,250. Depending upon one's political leanings, this final action of the Franco-Prussian War was viewed as either heroic or a massacre. Nonetheless, the French on both sides had done more physical damage to the city during this 1-week period than had the Prussians during the entire 5-month-long siege. Parts of Paris were in total ruins. Many of Paris's residents who had fled the city in February were in no great hurry to return to the chaos of the city's streets. One Parisian who never returned was Napoleon III, who spent the remainder of his life with Eugenie, exiled once again in Great Britain, where he died some 2 years later. Even then, it took another 2 years to finally complete the Paris Opera House before it would house its inaugural performance. Napoleon never saw the completed gem of his Parisian urban renewal. I'd like to add a footnote to this lecture, and that is that during the siege by the Prussians, Viollet-le-Duc made copious notes of the effects of artillery during the siege and published his findings after the war. So thorough were these notes that they formed the basis of France's national defense plans up to 1940, when France again would be forced to surrender to the Germans. So it can be said that the entire idea of the construction of the Maginot Line can be traced back to Viollet-le-Duc's notes during the siege of 1870.